very much. Well, I am very delighted to introduce two incredibly experienced professionals from the data communications industry. We have with us this evening Ruth Pritchard-Kelly. She's a senior advisor for regulatory affairs at OneWeb. She's advising legal and technical policy analysts who are working on satellite policy, and 30 years of experience in the area. We're delighted to have Ruth with us. She also works on the US Commerce Department's Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, which is a mouthful, and she's also on the board of the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation. So Ruth, thanks for joining us. We've also got Amy Mehlman. Now she's leading Viasat's government relation efforts in the United States, and she's helping determine its global policy strategies. Another 25 years of experience. Amy's been advising business leaders across satellite, wireless, telecom, equipment sectors, and she's represented innovators before the US Congress, different federal agencies, and the executive branch or in the US, as well as international regulatory and legislative branches. Crikey, it is a genuine pleasure to meet you both. Let's start off with Amy. What I'd like you to do, Amy, is introduce us to your company Viasat. Tell us how you're currently using satellite technology to connect our world.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me, Andy, for sure, and Catherine for moderating the panel. And I think I've aged myself completely with my bio, but hopefully the picture was better. Anyway, look, Viasat has been around for quite some time, since about 1985, when our founders sort of founded it in their garage type thing. It's a great American story here, but we, embarked on a mission to connect the world. Mostly we've been focusing on geostationary satellites to do so. We have a fleet of geostationary satellites, both in orbit, but also in production. Our Viasat 3s are looking to provide coverage. The first one over the Americas, the second one over the EMEA region, and the third, within a couple of years over the APAC region. And really the idea was to, get the cost per bit down such that, those who were struggling to, afford connectivity or even, have any reach for connectivity could do so in an affordable manner. So, we believe that geostationary satellites were, probably best to do that. Now, as Ruth will probably tell you as well, and we certainly see this for, clients of ours, customers of ours that we build for. We know that there are some low latency applications that need to be addressed, and so those are being addressed by folks like OneWeb and us as well. We are looking at systems such as those as well. We do a lot of work in the antenna business as well. So there are a lot of issues that we've been focusing on, many of which you have been in this conference already, and will do so as we continue, mostly on orbital debris, certainly how to solve these problems from a light pollution perspective. And what is the landscape going to look like? What are the rules going to look like surrounding all of this? And how are we going to all coexist together? And that's really our goal, is to work with, our industry, your industry, and, figure out how best to connect the world while doing it safely. So look, I really appreciate you guys having us, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to take a pause in the question there, just ask you to define something. So you use the term low latency there for people who aren't up on the jargon terms. Can you explain what that means for us?
Sure. I mean, so if you're looking at a geostation, I mean, it's physics, right? If you're looking at a geostationary satellite, the time for you to connect to the ground is going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more of a lag than it would be from a low Earth orbit satellite. Although we're talking, 600 milliseconds difference, something like that, 700 maybe, depending. But I do think that, the policies around low latency applications have really been driving the surge of LEO, LEO systems, and they're pushed to launch. I mean, they're, for example, in the
LEO
United States,
system is low Earth orbit.
low Earth orbit systems. I
Very good.
apologize. Yes. So acronyms, we need like a money jar for acronyms, but this is DC. We always, we do this anyway. But there's, funding mechanisms and everything, and they're putting a premium on low latency applications. So that's sort of helping drive things. Although, again, I'll pass it over to Ruth next, but I'm sure will tell you a lot about, some of the other needs, connectivity needs that are driving this as well.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, Ruth, so let me invite you to introduce us to your company, OneWeb. How does your approach to global communications differ from Viasat and this geostationary orbit?
Thank you so much, Catherine. And Amy, obviously we know each other well. And despite my accent, OneWeb is very much a UK system. So that's one of the primary differences. There are technical differences. There are sort of business plan differences. What market are you headed toward? And there are political differences. And all of these have led to this plethora, really, of systems right now, right? And so there are 5 or 6 truly viable systems being proposed. Starlink has started to launch. OneWeb has started to launch. Forgive me, it seems like my internet connection may not be great. Apologies. Samantha, I'm glad you've got good connectivity in rural Canada, but I assure you, the First Nations in the far north have been begging for these systems to come along. And so when Amy talks about latency, everybody knows what it's like to talk on a satellite connection for a voice call, right? There's a delay. And everybody knows what it's like to try to check your bank account via a geostationary satellite. You time out. So you need low latency. You need almost no delay. And that's why Telesat from Canada, OneWeb from the UK, Amazon, Viasat, and Starlink, all out of the United States. I can't remember the Russian system, but they've got one planned. The Chinese have 3, right? So they won't all come to fruition, but because of political reasons, you're going to see probably 3, right? So there'll be a US system, and there will be people who don't want to use or aren't allowed to use a US licensed system, right? And the same for a Chinese system. They're going to have one because they'll have needs that they feel insecure using a non-Chinese built and licensed system. So there are, unfortunately, political issues. Technically, we're all trying something different, right? So the OneWeb satellites orbit the poles. They look like lines of longitude on your globe. And we call each one of those lines a plane. We think it will take us roughly 600 satellites at 1,200 kilometers to serve the globe. But honestly, Catherine, we're all doing this pretty much for the first time. Viasat doesn't think it will take that many satellites. Starlink, God bless them, have asked for 42,000, right? So that's probably, forgive the school bus, that's probably crazy talk, okay? I don't think anyone thinks it'll need that, but it's scary. It is scary in the very conversation that we are having, because everybody likes the skies. I mean, I like the skies. And to think inadvertently that our plans to connect the world, which is incredibly idealistic, right? We see connectivity to the internet as a human right also, right? Information, access to information. We couldn't have this call without connectivity to the internet. You couldn't warn the world of an impending meteor strike without connectivity. So we need it. All of us need it. And it really is a conversation. We are with the StarCon 2 group. We are with various observatories around the world. We are devastated that our plans to aid the world have inadvertently caused a real problem. So definitely the discussion continues. We are in our Gen 1 right now. Gen 2, there could be things, there should be things that we can do with the design. For example, fewer satellites that are more powerful, right? And so it's a numbers game. The more objects there are, the harder it is for astronomers, right? Yeah. And we're talking live satellites and especially debris, right? So the real problem with a 42,000 satellite constellation is as they age out, right now, the international guidelines give them 25 years to get out of space, right? That's crazy. Do you know how many dead satellites they'll have perfectly legally unless we update those international guidelines, right? So we as a world need to work together, and we as OneWeb really deeply want to make sure that we're doing the responsible things.
Thanks, Ruth. I mean, I think that sort of echoes what Meredith was saying earlier, that it's great to see these companies working together with astronomers. But Amy, let me just come back to you. So Ruth said that OneWeb is looking at 600 of these satellites. We are looking at these headlines about SpaceX. Unfortunately, we did invite them to join us tonight, but unfortunately they couldn't make us. So they already have 1,500 satellites up there, approved plans to launch 12,000. What does that offer us? I mean, Viasat has fewer than OneWeb, and SpaceX is, as Ruth was saying, so many more. So what is Starlink going to be able to offer us with those tens of thousands that Viasat and OneWeb can't? Is there anything that it can do differently?
I don't think so, to be honest. I mean, I think we have been pushing for rules to contain this to some degree, because I don't think that's needed. And what I'm fearful of is that it actually promotes the exact wrong thing. And this is getting to what Ruth was saying, right? If you can come up with some binding rules that sort of manage what is safe, what is acceptable, both from a communication standpoint, from a national security standpoint, from a light pollution standpoint, all of these things included, I think you're going to get to a place where you're driving people toward fewer, more capable satellites. And what does that mean? I mean, if you look at what the FCC did, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, they've made some decisions, including allowing up to 12,000 SpaceX satellites. And the result of that really is the reaction that you're seeing, for example, in China. I mean, they in fact specifically said that their systems are in reaction to the Elon Musk system. So if you just look at the percentages of what the US has from a geostationary standpoint, the numbers of satellites that they have probably 20 to 40% of the satellites out there today, right? Separate that from SpaceX, just what had existed. Right now, they've actually approved almost 50,000 if you look at it in total. Extrapolate that to the rest of the world. You may end up seeing somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 satellites in LEO orbit. That's unsustainable. A small percentage of that is probably unsustainable. Everything has to be perfect in order for it to actually coexist, right? Everybody's going
because we're running short on time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, let's get. I want to get to the essence of this latency issue. Ruth was mentioning it. The slow satellite phone. Is that the difference? Why does SpaceX want all of these very, very low Earth orbits? Is it to do with the very fast latency or fast speeds that you get from that? Is that the technical difference here, Ruth?
No, all of the LEOs are offering lower latency. So the Viasat LEO, Telesat, OneWeb, they're all going to be the equivalent of 4G quality connection, right? That is the idea, and they'll provide 5G for the most part when that's been standardized. I think that SpaceX might be more, well, it's similar to another concern, fast fashion or disposable, right? You buy something cheap at Primark and you throw it away a month later, as opposed to buying something incredibly expensive that lasts for 50 years. So SpaceX is doing cheap, fast, get them up quickly. If they fail, I don't care, launch something better. And they want massive amounts of capacity in small, cheap satellites. Whereas Viasat and OneWeb and some of the others are saying, no, test it on the ground, for God's sake, get it right, make it larger and more powerful to begin with, And so we're only going to need, and as I said, our Gen 1 is planned for about 550 on orbit with spares. We are hoping truly that Gen 2 will be fewer satellites, right? Because they'll be more powerful and you won't need as many, especially since we're now aware that it is a light pollution problem, if not a radio pollution problem, right? So I'm telling you, nobody wants to hurt the astronomers or astronomy.
I'm feeling very comforted. I'm feeling
Right.
very comforted, Andy. We have a very short amount of time for questions from the panelists.
A lot of discussion about is latency really what you need, or isn't it just bandwidth? And couldn't you do that from geo perhaps?
And again, if I may, as Amy said, quite a few applications, especially if it's a one-way broadcast or you don't need a quick response in return, absolutely can be done from geostationary, and that would be a better technology, right? And some things you're close enough to a city center and you can do them with fiber or cellular mobile, and that would be a better technology, right? But in between are areas where you can't lay fiber, they're mountainous or they're over the water. Or it's too expensive, it's not going to happen. How are you best going to cover those parts of the globe? That's what you need the LEO satellites for. And honestly, you cannot check your bank account if the delay is too long. So these are real concerns. You cannot do somebody's health check or their blood pressure via a geostationary satellite if the delay is too long. So there are different applications for different technologies.
Yeah, could I just add just real quick? I would say that these things are complementary of each other, right? So I do think that GEO provides an extreme amount of capacity over a large area, and then there are the applications that are much needed from a low latency perspective that can complement the GEO or vice versa. So I do think you could have a smaller number of the LEOs, in the GEOs, and then you have a great system. But the rules that are put out there will decide everything.
Another question from Catherine Courtney. What do the panel think is getting in the way of agreeing internationally binding rules? Surely operators also want to achieve a safe operating environment.
Politics are an issue. I think that operators are very concerned about collisions and debris. Obviously, we lose money if either of those things happen. So it's not in our own personal interests to have a collision or to cause debris. But are the Chinese going to share their location ephemeris with the US military? Probably not, right? And so how do you get that global consensus?
Yeah, I would agree to a large extent with Ruth, although I do think that, some have different plans than others as far as how they do things and how they design and test and operate their systems. And, some of these binding rules may be more preclusive for some rather than others. And so that's where those politics come in.
And one more question from Joseph Sabera and John Frame are concerned about dead satellites and removing old satellites. And for example, isn't there a significant failure rate? Why not have an international policy that works like carbon offsetting, that if you launch a satellite, you have to pay to bring some other satellites down?
That's a very clever idea. And I would say that the community is working toward debris removal, right? So I know ESA has a program that OneWeb is involved in. And Astroscale and Clear Sky, the sort of debris removal industry is definitely kicking into high gear. OneWeb has designed its satellites with a magnetic grappling feature such that when they need to be retrieved and when the industry is mature enough, we will be able to hire a company to go and remove the debris. I think we should not only, leave no trace of our current constellation, but I agree that as a world, as a global community, we need to clean up what we left there before.
Yeah.
And I think we have to move on probably. So one final question here about land grabs. There's a sense that some of the FCC and ITU filings are for large numbers of satellites that maybe are just trying to shut other companies out, and aren't really, is there really a need for these hundreds of thousands of satellites?
I think that's actually a really huge concern. I do. I think we're in a, first in type situation. I mean, there are not rules such as they were, for example, for geostationary satellites. They had sort of the spacing rules, through the ITU. That took a long time. And unfortunately, we're in a situation now where the rules aren't necessarily there in place and could take some time, and technology is kind of passing this by. So unless you're dealing with some of these issues and rules and interference concerns at the national level, to deal with this, impending concern, I don't think you're going to get to where you need to be in the short term. I think the ITU is working on some of these issues, but it's not going to come in time for what we need for the pace of the launches that are happening today.
Well,
okay,
actually, if I could just interject quickly. In fact, at the last World Radio Conference, the ITU did create for the first time, build out milestones for the LEO constellation, so that if you ask for, say, 42,000 satellites, you have 7 years. You have to have 10% up in 3 years and 50% in 5. And if you don't have, say, 4,200 satellites up in your 3 years, however much you have will become your 10%. So it will effectively become your new 10%, and thus limit the amount. And what's going to happen there is you don't have the money, or there isn't the demand. You're not going to build that enormous system, right? And so I think this is actually a great set of new rules out of the ITU for the constellations.
so I'm going to jump in there. This has been a fantastic session, actually, and very interesting responses from our industry representatives here. And there's been to be a couple of very interesting points from Moriba about tracking data, but we'll come back to that later, Moriba, okay?